Something shifted last week that almost nobody noticed. Not a missile launch, not a military drill, not even a formal announcement. It was quieter than that. And that is exactly what makes it so dangerous. China, the one country Iran believed would always have its back. The one nation that kept buying its oil when the whole world turned away. The one partner that signed a 25-year deal worth hundreds of billions of dollars. That China just sent a signal to Tehran that no one in the Middle East was prepared for. And the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow ribbon of water where nearly 20% of the world's oil passes every single day, may never function the same way again. But to understand why this moment is so significant, you need to understand what was supposed to be the most unbreakable alliance in modern geopolitics, and why it just cracked. For years, the relationship between China and Iran looked bulletproof. While the United States piled on sanctions, China kept its refineries running on Iranian crude. While Europe distanced itself from Tehran, Beijing expanded trade routes, investment deals, and diplomatic cover. While the rest of the world treated Iran like a pariah, China treated it like a partner. In 2021, they signed what many analysts call the deal of the century, a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership. China would invest up to $400 billion into Iran's infrastructure, energy sector, and military modernization. In return, Iran would supply China with discounted oil for decades. It looked like the ultimate axis of resistance against Western dominance. Iran believed it had found its anchor, its protector, its economic lifeline in a world that had tried to strangle it. But what most people don't realize is that China never signed that deal out of loyalty. China signed it out of strategy, and strategies change. Here is what started shifting beneath the surface. China's economy has been under enormous pressure. Growth is slowing, the property sector collapsed, youth unemployment hit record highs. Exports are facing tariff walls from the United States and Europe, and the last thing Beijing can afford right now is an unstable energy supply chain. And that is where the Strait of Hormuz enters the picture. The Strait of Hormuz is a choke point, a 33-kilometer wide passage between Iran and Oman. Every single day, roughly 17 to 21 million barrels of oil pass through it. That is oil going to China, Japan, South Korea, India, and most of the Gulf economies. Iran has threatened to close this strait multiple times. It has seized tankers in these waters. It has launched drone attacks near shipping lanes. It has used the strait as a pressure valve whenever it felt cornered by the West. For a long time, China tolerated this, because cheap Iranian oil was more valuable than the inconvenience of instability. But what happened next changed everything. The Red Sea crisis broke the calculation wide open. When the Houthi attacks began targeting commercial shipping in the Red Sea, backed by Iran's weapons and training, the ripple effects were immediate and global. Shipping costs exploded, insurance premiums tripled, major container lines rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks and billions to supply chains. China watched this unfold with growing alarm. Because China does not just consume oil through the Strait of Hormuz, China is the world's largest trading nation. Its exports, its imports, its entire economic engine depends on stable sea lanes. And Iran's network of proxies was now actively threatening those lanes. For the first time, Beijing started doing a quiet but brutal calculation. Is Iran an asset or a liability? The answer was becoming uncomfortable. But this is where things take a serious turn. China began a series of diplomatic moves that, when you line them up, tell a story that Tehran should be deeply worried about. First, China started deepening its economic relationships with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar. These are Iran's primary rivals in the Gulf. Beijing didn't just maintain those relationships, it accelerated them. Energy deals, infrastructure investments, technology transfers, and even quiet security conversations. Second, China participated in multilateral Gulf security dialogues that pointedly excluded Iran from the table. Not loudly, not provocatively, but deliberately. Third, Chinese state media, which is never accidentally anything, began publishing analysis pieces that questioned Iran's regional behavior. In a system where the media does not sneeze without political direction, this was not accidental commentary. And fourth, perhaps most telling of all, Chinese officials began making statements about the importance of freedom of navigation in international waters. Freedom of navigation. That is Western diplomatic language. That is the phrase the United States Navy uses to justify its presence in contested waters. That is the phrase that Iran despises above almost any other. And China started using it. Tehran noticed. Of course it noticed. Iranian officials responded with a mixture of public defiance and private panic. They doubled down on rhetoric about the axis of resistance. They emphasized their strategic partnership with China. They reminded the world that China still depends on Iranian oil. But behind closed doors, the conversations were different. Because Iran understands something that its leadership does not like to admit publicly. China does not do loyalty. China does leverage, and the leverage equation was shifting. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and the broader Gulf Cooperation Council represent an economic relationship with China worth many times the value of the Iran deal. The Gulf states buy Chinese technology, they invest in Chinese infrastructure funds, they align with China on multilateral platforms. They offer Beijing something Iran cannot: stability, scale, and international legitimacy. Iran offers oil at a discount and a constant geopolitical headache. When you lay those two things side by side, the math is not complicated. Now here is what this means for the Strait of Hormuz. For decades, Iran's control over the strait, or at least its ability to threaten the strait, was its single greatest piece of geopolitical leverage. It was the gun Iran kept pointed at the global economy whenever it needed to remind the world that it could not simply be ignored. And for decades, that leverage worked, because the countries that depended on the strait, including China, calculated that the cost of confronting Iran was higher than the cost of tolerating it. That calculation is now changing. China is quietly signaling that it will not use its UN Security Council veto to protect Iran indefinitely. It is signaling that it will not absorb the economic disruption of Iranian proxy behavior without consequences. It is signaling that its strategic interests in Gulf stability now outweigh its strategic interests in the China-Iran partnership. This is not a small shift. This is tectonic. Because without Chinese diplomatic cover, Iran's position in every global forum becomes dramatically weaker. Without China absorbing its oil, Iran's economy faces pressure that sanctions alone could never create. And without the perception that China stands behind it, Iran's deterrence posture, the entire architecture of fear and uncertainty it has built around the strait, begins to erode. But what happened next was something nobody in Washington, Riyadh, or even Tel Aviv fully anticipated. China did not just shift its diplomatic posture. It began inserting itself into the Strait of Hormuz equation in an entirely new way. Chinese naval vessels, which have been operating in the Indian Ocean and Gulf of Aden for years under the banner of anti-piracy missions, began appearing in patterns that analysts found unusual. Not provocative, not aggressive, but present and positioned. China was not protecting Iran's interests in these waters. It was protecting its own. And there is an enormous difference between those two things. When China positions naval assets near the Strait of Hormuz, it is not there to help Iran threaten the shipping lanes. It is there to ensure that Iran cannot close them. It is there to protect the oil that flows to Chinese refineries, the goods that move through Chinese shipping networks, and the economic lifeline that Beijing cannot afford to have disrupted by anyone, including its supposed strategic partner. This is the moment that changes the entire power dynamic of the Middle East. Think about what this means for a moment. Iran built its entire regional strategy around the assumption that China would never allow the West to fully isolate or militarily confront it. That assumption gave Iran the confidence to expand its proxy network across Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. It gave Iran the willingness to push its nuclear program forward despite international pressure. It gave Iran the belief that no matter how far it pushed, there would always be a powerful nation standing between it and the full consequences of its actions. That assumption is now in question. And in geopolitics, when a foundational assumption collapses, everything built on top of it becomes unstable. Iran's deterrence was never purely military. A country with a struggling economy, outdated conventional forces, and international isolation cannot win a direct military confrontation with a coalition of its adversaries. Iran's real deterrence was always strategic ambiguity, and the threat of escalation, and the belief that powerful backers would prevent anyone from calling its bluff. Remove the backer, and the bluff is visible. There's another dimension to this story that is rarely discussed. China's relationship with Israel, despite the tensions of the past few years, has never fully collapsed. Chinese technology companies still operate in Israel. Chinese investors still hold stakes in Israeli ports and infrastructure. Beijing has carefully avoided the kind of wholesale anti-Israel positioning that would permanently close that door. This matters because it signals something about China's long-term strategic vision for the Middle East. China does not want a region defined by the Iran-Israel conflict. It does not want a Middle East consumed by sectarian proxy wars. It does not want a Strait of Hormuz that could be closed by any single actor's political decision. China wants a Middle East that is stable enough to serve as a reliable energy supplier and a growing market for Chinese goods and infrastructure investment. Iran, as it has operated in recent years, is incompatible with that vision. However, this is where things get genuinely complicated. China's shift away from Iran does not mean China is moving toward the West. It does not mean Beijing is joining any American-led coalition. It does not mean the geopolitical competition between China and the United States is softening in any way. What it means is that China is pursuing something more sophisticated than simple alliance politics. It is pursuing dominance without confrontation. Beijing wants to be the indispensable nation in every regional conflict, the party that every side needs to talk to, The power that can move oil markets, influence diplomatic outcomes, and project military presence without ever firing a shot. In the Middle East, that means being essential to the Gulf states, essential to Iran, essential to Israel, essential to Turkey, essential to every player on the board simultaneously. That is not loyalty to any side. That is leverage over every side. And the Strait of Hormuz is the ultimate leverage point. Whoever controls the conditions around that strait controls the energy security of half the world. And right now, China is positioning itself not as Iran's protector of that strait, but as the independent guarantor of its stability. That is a role the United States has played for 5 decades. And China just announced, quietly but unmistakably, that it intends to share it. The consequences of this shift are going to unfold over months and years, not days. Iran will not collapse overnight. The relationship will not end with a dramatic public rupture. China does not operate that way. It will be a slow, quiet, methodical withdrawal of the assurances that Iran depended on. Fewer favorable votes in international bodies, less diplomatic cover in nuclear negotiations, more pressure, delivered privately, to pull back proxy activities that disrupt shipping. A gradual reduction in the premium that China places on the relationship. And Iran will face a choice it has never truly had to face before. Adapt to a world where its most powerful partner no longer absorbs the cost of its behavior. Or continue down a path that leads to a level of isolation even more severe than what sanctions alone could create. For the Gulf states, this shift is nothing short of transformational. Saudi Arabia, which spent years watching China publicly support Iran while privately doing business with Riyadh, is now watching Beijing tilt the scales. The Abraham Accords changed the regional political architecture. The China-brokered Saudi-Iran normalization deal was supposed to create a new equilibrium. But beneath the surface diplomacy, the power balance has continued moving. The UAE is quietly expanding its role as a Chinese logistics hub. Qatar is deepening energy cooperation with Beijing. Bahrain, Kuwait, and Oman are all recalibrating their relationships with China in light of this new reality. The Gulf is not becoming a Chinese sphere of influence, but it is becoming a zone where China's preferences matter enormously, in some ways more than America's, and Iran is no longer on the right side of those preferences. And the Strait of Hormuz itself? It will remain one of the most strategically critical pieces of ocean on the planet. The geography does not change. The oil does not move. The choke point remains. But the politics of who controls the narrative around that strait, who can credibly threaten it, who can credibly defend it, and who has the economic weight to determine what happens there, that politics is being rewritten right now. For the first time in modern history, there is a scenario emerging where both the United States and China have a shared interest in keeping that strait open. Not because they are allies, not because they trust each other, but because both of their economies depend on it, and neither can afford to let any single nation hold it hostage. That convergence of interest, however fragile and however temporary, fundamentally changes the threat that Iran can pose. A Iran that can only close the strait by triggering a confrontation with both American and Chinese interests is not the same Iran that existed 5 years ago. So, what does this all mean? It means the Middle East is entering a new phase, one where the old certainties no longer hold, where alliances that looked permanent are proving conditional, where the country that shaped itself as the ultimate anti-Western power broker in the region is discovering that its most important partner was never on its side. It was only ever on its own side. China did not flip on Iran out of pressure from Washington. It did not flip out of ideology or moral calculation. It flipped because the math changed. Because in the end, China is not building an empire of loyalty. It is building an empire of leverage. And Iran, which spent a decade believing it was China's indispensable partner, is learning what every nation eventually learns when it mistakes strategic convenience for genuine alliance. The moment you stop being useful, the calculus changes. And right now, instability in the Strait of Hormuz is no longer useful to China. Stability is. That single shift, quiet as it was, may end up reshaping the Middle East, more than any war, any sanction, or any diplomatic summit of the past 20 years. The strait is still there. The oil is still flowing. But the invisible hand that once allowed Iran to threaten all of it just moved to the other side of the table, and nothing in this region will be quite the same again.